The rope burned through Elvira Sawyer's palms as she lowered the weighted line down into the well shaft for the 37th time that August morning, and for the 37th time it came back up dry. Not damp, not muddy, dry as a bone, dry as the cracked earth stretching in every direction across the Sawyer ranch, dry as the future that yawned open before her like a grave. She stood at the lip of the stone well her father had dug 22 years ago, the summer before she was born, and she let herself feel the full weight of what this meant. The cattle were already showing ribs. 3 of the horses had stopped eating. And her father, Hank Sawyer, was lying in the back bedroom with a fever that had been climbing for 6 days, his body fighting a battle his will had already half surrendered. She had exactly 4 days of water left in the storage barrels. 4 days for herself, for the livestock, for the land. Then a voice cut through the hammer of her heartbeat. Miss Sawyer. She turned, and there he was, standing at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hands and dust on his boots, and a look on his face that told her he already knew. Luke Fletcher. 26 years old, built like the land itself, all hard angles and quiet endurance, with dark eyes that had seen things she suspected he would never speak aloud. He worked the adjacent Holloway property, or he had until Holloway sold out to Renner and Associates 2 months prior. Since then he had been drifting, picking up work where he could find it. She had not asked him to come. She had not asked anyone. "You heard," she said. It was not a question. "Town's talking," Luke said. He took 1 step forward, then stopped, respecting the invisible line she kept around herself. "Said the Sawyer well went dry, said your father is bad sick, said you were out here alone." "I am alone," Elvira said. "I have been managing this ranch alone for 3 years, Mr. Fletcher. Being alone is not a crisis." He met her eyes, and she saw something in his that was not pity. It was closer to recognition. "No," he said quietly, "but a dry well in August is." She could not argue with that. What she could not have known, standing there with rope burn on her hands and fear locked tight behind her ribs, was that the answer she was searching for had been sitting beneath the earth for 60 years, waiting. Hidden by a secret that predated her father's arrival on this land, buried under a deliberate act of concealment that had motives she would spend the next week unraveling, one thread at a time. And she could not have known that Luke Fletcher carried a piece of that secret in his own dark past, sewn into a story he had never told anyone, that would bind them together in ways that had nothing to do with crisis, and everything to do with the kind of truth that changes a person's life. But all of that was still ahead. For now there was just the dry well, the burning sun, and a man who had come without being asked. She studied him for a long moment. She was 23 years old, Elvira Sawyer, and she had been studying people the way other women studied embroidery patterns, with precision, with patience, with an eye for what was hidden in the weave. She had taught herself to read geological survey maps at 14, using books borrowed from the Millhaven County Library 80 miles away. She had taught herself to track underground water sources using the old methods, Spanish and indigenous techniques she had pieced together from sources most men in this territory had never heard of. She had known for 2 years that the main well was declining. She had charted it, measured the water table drop, recorded it in the notebook she kept in her leather satchel. She had been preparing. She had a plan. What she had not accounted for was how fast it would go at the end. "Can you use a shovel?" she asked Luke Fletcher. He blinked. He had clearly expected her to argue, to send him away, to put that fierce independence of hers between them like a wall. "I can use a shovel," he said. "Then come with me," Elvira said. "There is something I need to find." She walked away without waiting to see if he followed. He did. 6 weeks before the well ran dry, the summer had arrived in New Mexico territory the way it always did in 1887, which was to say it arrived like a verdict. The sky turned white with heat. The creosote flattened against the ground. The Rio Perdido, the small seasonal tributary that ran along the western edge of the Sawyer property, shrank to a trickle by mid-July, and then to nothing by the 28th. Elvira had watched all of this with the careful attention she brought to everything. She was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who measured. Her father, Hank Sawyer, had started complaining of headaches in late July. By the 1st of August, he was running a temperature. The town doctor, a man named Caldwell who smelled of rye whiskey and overconfidence, came out on the 3rd, pronounced it heat exhaustion, left some willow bark powder, and charged $3 for the pleasure of being wrong. By the 5th, the fever had spread to Hank's lungs and settled in for a stay. Elvira had ridden into Millhaven herself, 16 miles on a horse that was already suffering from the heat, and spoken to Dr. Caldwell with a directness that had made the man's collar appear to tighten on its own. "It is pneumonia," she told him. "The fever pattern is wrong for heat exhaustion. The cough is productive and worsening. You will come back out or you will give me the medications and I will administer them myself." He had given her the medications. She had ridden home, administered them correctly, and begun keeping her father's temperature chart on the same notebook pages where she tracked the water table. The ranch hands, 3 men who had worked the Sawyer property for years, had left at the beginning of August when word spread that the water was failing. She did not blame them entirely. 2 had families in town. The 3rd, a young man named Prescott, had simply ridden away without a word, which told her what she needed to know about his character. So she was alone. She had the cattle, 38 head. She had the horses, 6 of them. She had 4 dogs who followed her everywhere and whose water she prioritized above her own. And she had her notebook, her surveying instruments, her geological maps, and a mind that did not stop working even when her body needed it to. The secret of the cistern had begun with a map, not a modern map, not a surveyor's careful rendering. This was an old map, so old that the paper had gone the color of weak tea, folded into quarters and tucked behind a loose stone in the hearth of the ranch house, in a gap that her father had always dismissed as a structural flaw. Elvira had found it 3 days before the well ran dry, while she was doing a thorough inventory of the house's potential resources, because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who looked behind every stone when the situation demanded it. The map was labeled in 2 languages. Spanish at the top, in faded ink that read Hacienda de la Tierra Oculta, which she translated as the Hidden Land Ranch, or perhaps more accurately, the Ranch of the Hidden Earth. Beneath that, in a different hand in English, were the words, "Water do not show, do not show." 2 words that carried a weight of secrets, of deliberate concealment, of a choice made by someone long dead to hide something essential from anyone who came after. The map showed the rough outline of what was now the Sawyer property, and in the southern pasture, approximately 300 yards from the main house, it showed a circle with a cross inside it and the notation cisterna in Spanish. A cistern, an old one. Spanish colonial era, possibly, which would put its construction somewhere in the early 1800s or even before, back when the land had belonged to a different world entirely, before the Mexican-American War reshuffled the ownership of this territory with the cavalier confidence of men drawing lines on maps they had never walked. She had not told anyone about the map, not because she was hiding it, but because there was no one to tell. Her father was delirious with fever. The hands were gone. And she was not in the habit of sharing discoveries before she understood them. She had charted the location from the map's markings, cross-referenced it with her own geological survey notes, and by the morning of August the 7th, she was standing in the southern pasture with a probe rod and a notebook, moving in a methodical grid pattern, searching for signs of buried stonework. It was that afternoon that Luke Fletcher arrived. She did not tell him about the map immediately. She showed him where she needed to dig, gave him the dimensions of her search grid, and watched him pick up a shovel without asking questions. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He picked up the shovel and he worked. Most men, she had found in her 23 years, asked questions in direct proportion to how much they doubted the person giving the directions. A man who trusted your judgment just worked. She found herself recalibrating her assessment of Luke Fletcher as the afternoon unfolded. The heat was brutal. By 2 in the afternoon, the thermometer she had hung on the fence post read 103 degrees. Luke stripped off his vest and worked in his shirt, the fabric dark with sweat, his movements steady and rhythmic. He did not complain. He did not suggest stopping. He matched her pace, which was relentless. "You surveyed this yourself?" he asked at one point, nodding at the grid markers she had driven into the ground. "I did," she said. He looked at the grid. It was a proper survey grid with measured intervals and directional markers, the kind of layout that took skill and knowledge to set up correctly. "That's professional work," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." There was a pause while he seemed to decide whether to say more. "Where did you learn that?" he finally asked. "Books," she said, "and practice and thinking." She looked at him steadily. "Most things can be learned that way." He nodded, and she saw it again, that thing in his eyes that was not condescension. He was listening. By 4 in the afternoon, Elvira's probe rod hit stone. Not the natural stone that ran through the clay soil in irregular veins. This was flat stone, laid flat with the purposeful regularity of human work. She felt the difference in the way the rod transmitted the impact back through her hands, a geologist's intuition she had spent years cultivating. "Here," she said quietly. Luke came to where she was standing. She showed him the probe rod, showed him the depth marker, showed him the angle of the stone. He looked at it, looked at her, and picked up his shovel. They dug for 2 hours. The sun was dropping toward the western mountains when Elvira's shovel rang against the capstone. Not rock. Dressed stone, mortared and fitted with the kind of careful masonry that told a story of labor, of skill, of intention. Luke crouched at the edge of the hole they had dug and ran his hand along the edge of the capstone. His jaw was set and his eyes were bright, and she saw something shift in his expression, a kind of wonder that sat strangely on a face built for stoicism. "This is old," he said. "Spanish colonial, I think," Elvira said. She was already looking for the edge of the capstone, already calculating how to remove it. The land was a Spanish land grant before the Mexican period, before the treaty. This might be 200 years old. Luke looked at her. "How do you know that?" She pulled the map from her satchel and showed it to him. He held it carefully as if he understood old things deserved careful handling and read it in the fading light. His lips moved slightly. She noted that he was reading the Spanish notation, not just looking at the drawing. "You read Spanish?" she asked. "Some," he said. "My mother was from Chihuahua." He handed the map back. "Do not show," he said quietly, repeating the English notation. "Someone deliberately hid this." "Yes," Elvira said. "And I intend to find out why." Moving the capstone took them another hour. It was thick dressed limestone, and even with 2 people and a pry bar, it was a project that demanded patience and leverage and a willingness to ache. But when it finally shifted and they rolled it back and looked down into the dark below, a wave of cool air rose up from the earth and hit Elvira's face like a mercy. She pressed her eyes shut for one single moment. Water. There was water down there. She could feel it in the temperature differential, could smell the particular mineral cool of it, could hear the faintest acoustic echo of depth and liquid below the stone lip of the opening. "Get the lantern," she said, her voice steady even though something in her chest was anything but. Luke had the lantern lit and lowered on a rope before she had finished speaking, and when its light filled the interior of the cistern, they both leaned over the edge and looked. It was perhaps 15 feet deep, cut directly into the limestone substrate, its walls lined with smoothed stone and sealed with a hydraulic lime mortar that had held for over a century. And at the bottom, dark and still and beautiful as anything Elvira Sawyer had ever seen in her life, was water. Not just a little water. A substantial reservoir, fed by some fracture in the limestone below, some hidden percolation from the mountains to the north that had been filling this secret space for years, undisturbed, unknown, unharvested by the drought that had taken everything above ground. Luke Fletcher made a sound. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they have been trying very hard to keep a grip on hope, and something unexpectedly gives them a reason to keep holding on. Elvira looked at him. He was leaning over the edge of the cistern, lantern light catching the lines of his face, and his eyes were bright in a way that undid something in her careful, measured chest. "We found it," he said. "I found it," she said, but not unkindly. There was a small smile at the edge of her mouth that she could not entirely suppress. He looked at her, and she saw the shock of it move through him, not the shock of offense, but the shock of genuine impression. He was reckoning with something, she could see it, the way a man recalibrates when the world turns out to be different than the shape he had assigned to it. "You did," he said, and meant it fully. "How long did you know to look?" 3 days, she said, but the knowledge that made it possible took 9 years of study. She stood up, brushed the soil from her knees. "My father always said I read too much." He meant it as a criticism. I took it as a direction. Luke Fletcher laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and warm, and it changed his face entirely, burned away the careful stoicism, and left something younger and more open behind it. Elvira Sawyer filed this away in the same careful mental cabinet where she filed everything important. The next morning, they worked on getting the water out. Elvira had designed a simple pulley system using the equipment from the main well, modified to fit the dimensions of the cistern opening. She explained the engineering to Luke as she set it up, and he listened with the same focused attention he brought to everything, asking 2 precise questions and making one useful suggestion about the bucket configuration that she incorporated without ego. He noticed that she incorporated it. She noticed that he noticed. They were, both of them, taking very careful note of each other. The water was extraordinary. Cold and clean, filtered through limestone, with a mineral clarity that tasted unlike anything from the surface wells. Elvira tasted it first, tested it for any sulfur or contaminant smell, held it to the light, then declared it safe. She brought the first full bucket to her father's room. Hank Sawyer was a big man reduced by illness, gray-faced against the pillow, his breathing the labored process of someone who had been fighting for days. When Elvira brought the cold water and lifted his head and let him drink, he opened his eyes and looked at her with the expression of a man who had lost track of where he was. "Ellie," he said, which was what he had called her since she was small. "Drink," she said. "There's water. I found it. Rest." He drank, he slept. His fever over the following day began very slowly and very grudgingly to yield. On the 3rd day after finding the cistern, Elvira sat at the kitchen table with her geological notes and the old Spanish map and 3 other references she had requested from the county library months before, and she began to assemble the story of why the cistern had been hidden. Luke came in from watering the cattle, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept perpetually on the stove, and sat across from her without being invited. She looked at him. He looked back, unabashed. "You are welcome to sit," she said, dry as the summer air had been before the cistern. "Thank you," he said, without any detectable irony. She showed him what she had assembled, the old map. A land deed from 1854, the year the Gadsden Purchase had formalized this territory's transfer to the United States, that listed the property's original Spanish grant holder as one Don Alejandro Vila. A subsequent deed from 1859 showing the land passing to a man named Thomas Renner, purchased at a price that Elvira had calculated was significantly below fair market value even for that period. And then a 3rd document, a letter she had found folded inside the deed itself, in which someone named P.W. Renner, presumably a descendant of the original purchaser, wrote to someone whose name was obscured by age and water damage, saying that the water feature of the southern pasture should remain undisclosed for the purposes of controlling the adjacent water rights. Luke read all of this slowly and carefully. The kitchen was quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of the cattle, settled now, breathing easier since she had re-established their water supply. "Renner," he said. Something in his voice changed. Elvira looked at him. "You know that name," she said. He set the letter down on the table. His hands were flat on the wood and she could see the tendons in them shift as he steadied whatever was moving through him. "The Holloway property," he said. The one I worked for the past 4 years. Holloway sold it 2 months ago. Sold it to Renner and Associates. Elvira stared at him. The same family. The same family, Luke confirmed. Ezra Renner runs the operation now. He's been buying up land across the territory all spring and summer. Every property that's had water trouble, he has shown up 3 weeks later with an offer. The implications of this settled over Elvira like ice water. He knows about the water trouble before he makes the offer, she said. He has access to information about which wells are failing. Or he causes the wells to fail, Luke said. He said it quietly, carefully, with the caution of a man who understood what it meant to accuse someone powerful. I saw something at the Holloway property before the sale went through. In the northern pasture near the old windmill, someone had packed the primary drainage channel with clay and debris, redirected the runoff. I mentioned it to Holloway, and 2 days later Holloway told me Renner had made an offer and he was taking it. Elvira sat very still. Her mind was working at the speed it always worked at, which was faster than most people expected. Someone is deliberately compromising water access on properties adjacent to ones Renner wants to acquire, she said, creating drought conditions by manipulating drainage and water table access, then buying the land cheaply from ranchers who believe their water is simply gone. That's what I think, Luke said, but I couldn't prove it. I had no evidence that held up to anything, and Holloway was scared. And the Sawyer Ranch has been on that list, Elvira said. She looked at the map, at the hidden cistern marked with its circle and cross, and understood with perfect clarity why it had been hidden. The Renner family has known about this cistern for at least 30 years. They knew what the land held. They suppressed the information so that if the surface water failed, the ranch would appear to have no recoverable water source. Forcing your father to sell, Luke said. Except my father never knew to look and would not have known how, Elvira said. But I did. She looked up from the map and met his eyes. The question now is what to do with what we know. He held her gaze steadily. What are you thinking? She told him. What Elvira was thinking was this. She needed to document the cistern with a proper survey, have it witnessed and recorded at the county land office, establishing beyond any question that it existed, that it was on Sawyer land, and that it was a viable water source. She needed to do this before Renner could move to challenge the water rights or contest the property's value in any forced sale proceeding. She also needed to document the tampering at the drainage channel on the Holloway property, which was now Renner property, which meant getting access to land she did not own. Luke's jaw tightened when she laid this part out. That's trespassing, he said. I am aware of that, she said. Do you have a better suggestion for gathering evidence of tampering on a property you no longer work on? He was quiet for a moment. I still know where everything is, he said finally. And I know the patrol schedule, or I did when I left. Has it been 2 months, she asked. 8 weeks, 4 days, he said. She noted the precision. He had not rounded the number. That was interesting. Things may have changed, she said. Things may have, he agreed. They looked at each other across the table, across the map, across the assembled evidence of a 60-year conspiracy of hidden water and deliberate drought. The kitchen light was warm and the coffee between them was going cold, and Elvira Sawyer felt something she did not have a precise name for stirring in the carefully organized filing system she maintained inside her chest. She closed the notebook. Get some sleep, she told him. We go to the Holloway property at first light. He stood, taking his coffee cup to the wash basin with the automatic courtesy of a man accustomed to sharing space respectfully. He rinsed it. He set it on the rack. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. Miss Sawyer. Elvira, she said without thinking about it. He turned. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, the jaw, the cheekbones, the dark eyes that held something she was increasingly convinced was specific and directed and meant for her alone. Elvira, he said, trying the word as if he were assessing its weight. What you did finding that cistern, that's not something most people could have done. Not most men I've known, certainly. She met his eyes. No, she said, I know. He almost smiled. I'll be ready at first light, he said, and went out into the warm night. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after. not thinking about the cistern, not thinking about Renner or the evidence or the water rights documentation. She sat and thought about the way he had said her name, testing it, as if it were something he wanted to hold carefully. Then she put that thought in a separate drawer, closed it firmly, and went to check on her father. The ride to the Holloway property, now the Renner property, took 40 minutes in the gray pre-dawn, the horses picking their way across the dry terrain with the instinctive care of animals raised in this landscape. Elvira carried her surveying notebook, a measuring tape, and a small camera, a Kodak detective camera she had saved for 2 years to purchase, one of the first in the county. Luke carried his awareness of the land, which turned out to be something she could not have managed without. He knew every fence line, every gate, every patrol pattern, and he guided them to the northern pasture without triggering a single encounter. The drainage channel was there exactly as he had described it, a natural seasonal watercourse that would normally feed the water table of the adjacent properties, packed solid with clay and carefully arranged stone debris that bore the unmistakable geometry of deliberate work. Elvira photographed it from 4 angles. She measured the dimensions of the obstruction. She took soil samples. She sketched it in her notebook with the careful hand of a woman who had practiced technical drawing because no one had told her she could not. She also found something she had not expected. Carved into the large flat stone at the center of the obstruction, barely visible under a smear of clay that someone had imperfectly applied as camouflage, was an initial and a date. R 1885. 2 years ago, before the Holloway sale, before the drought, she showed Luke. She watched his face as he read it, watched the anger move through him in a slow, contained wave. The kind of anger a man feels when something he suspected is confirmed, and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion. He planned it, Luke said. He was setting this up 2 years before he made the offer. And the same thing may have been done on the Sawyer property, Elvira said. I need to check the Rio Perdido drainage. They found it that afternoon after a careful ride along the dry creek bed, the manipulation of the Rio Perdido's seasonal flow. Someone had built a small but effective diversion upstream, directing the seasonal water away from the Sawyer property and into a natural depression that had nowhere to go but evaporation. The diversion was newer than the one on the Holloway property, the stonework less settled, the clay still showing some of its original color. Elvira took photographs of everything. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. It was one of the things she had always been able to count on about herself, that in moments of genuine crisis, her hands were steady and her mind was clear, and the fear, if there was fear, went somewhere interior and constructive rather than outward and paralyzing. Luke was watching her work. She was aware of his attention in the same precise way she was aware of sun angle and wind direction, as something that had practical implications for how she oriented herself. "You're not scared," he said. "I am," she said. "But fear is information, not instruction." He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "I made it up," she said. "When I was 14 and the bank threatened to foreclose on the ranch the first time." He stared at her. "The first time. There have been 3 attempts," she said. "All of them failed." She capped her camera carefully. "The bank does not enjoy dealing with me." She heard Luke Fletcher make a sound that might, in another context, have been called a laugh of pure, startled admiration. She kept her face professional but filed the sound carefully. They rode back to the Sawyer ranch in the early evening, the horizon going amber and rose behind them, the mountains to the west catching the last light and turning purple-black. It was the kind of sky that made the hardship of this landscape briefly worth it, and Elvira, who was almost always too busy being practical to notice beauty, noticed it. Hank Sawyer was sitting up in bed when they returned. Not well, not by any measure, but sitting up, which was the first time in 5 days he had managed it. Elvira brought him broth and told him about the cistern in the same direct, informational tone she might have used to report the weather, watching his face go through shock and relief, and something more complicated that she understood when he reached out and put his hand over hers on the bedspread. "Your mother would have found it," he said. She had that same way of looking for what was underneath. Elvira's mother had died of scarlet fever when Elvira was 7. It was the kind of loss that either broke a person or built them into something of extraordinary density, and in Elvira's case it had done the latter, though she would not have described it that way herself. "I did find it," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did." He looked past her toward the doorway where Luke had paused, uncertain whether to enter. "Who's this?" "Luke Fletcher," Elvira said. "He's been helping. He used to work the Holloway property." Hank studied Luke with the particular assessment of a ranching man who has learned to read character from posture and eye contact. "Fletcher," he said. "You related to Douglas Fletcher. Used to run cattle up by Mesilla." "My uncle," Luke said. "He sold out in '82. "Good man," Hank said. "Terrible luck with water." He coughed a bad sound and settled back against the pillow. "Stay for supper," he told Luke. It was not quite an invitation. It was closer to a directive. "Thank you, sir," Luke said. Supper was simple: beans and salt pork and cornbread, because the supply situation was still challenging. But Elvira cooked it with efficiency and precision, and it was good food because she was, among her many competencies, a good cook. They ate at the kitchen table, and Hank ate in his room, and Luke washed up afterward at the basin outside without being asked. She found him on the porch when she came out later to check the barometer, the evening air finally dropping below 90 degrees. He was sitting on the step, forearms on his knees, looking at the stars. "Lots of them tonight," he said. "Clear air," she said. "No moisture to scatter the light." She read the barometer, steady. No storm coming, which was both a relief and a disappointment. He looked at her sideways. "Do you ever just look at them?" She considered this. "Sometimes," she said, "when I've finished with everything else." "And when is that?" "Never, usually," she admitted. He moved slightly on the step, making room. She sat down beside him, not because she needed to, but because the evening was still and the porch was where she would have been anyway, and there was no reason to stand when she could sit. They were close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him beside her, distinct from the heat of the day, which was finally relenting. "Why did you really come?" she asked. "Not the reason you told me, the real one." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had misjudged his willingness to be direct. Then he said, "I've been watching this ranch from across the fence line for 4 years. Watching how you ran it, how you made decisions, how you managed things no woman in this territory or any other I've been in gets credit for managing." He paused. "When I heard the well went dry, I thought about Renner. I thought about the pattern. And I thought that someone should be here who knew what was actually happening." She absorbed this. "You came to protect me," she said. "No," he said. "I came because I thought you should have the information about Renner. And because I wanted to see if you'd already figured it out." He almost smiled. "You had," he said. "You'd figured it out further than I had." "I usually have," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not a problem for me." She looked at him in the dark. "It is for most men." "Most men are fools," he said. It was not posturing. He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had reached this conclusion through evidence and found it disappointing but not surprising. The stars were very bright. The night had settled into something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like it might belong to the living rather than the crisis. "Tell me about your dark past," Elvira said. She said it almost lightly, but she meant it as a real question. She wanted to know. He looked at her sharply. "My dark past. Everyone in this territory has one," she said. "You have the look of a man who carries something specific, something that came before the Holloway property." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that an owl called from somewhere in the darkness and was answered from somewhere further away. "I had a homestead," he said finally, "up in Colorado territory. About 5 years ago. Small place but mine, built it myself or started to." He stopped. "There was a woman, we had plans." Elvira waited. She was very good at waiting. "She didn't make it through the first winter," he said. "Fever like your father has now, except there was no doctor close enough and I didn't know what I know now, and she was gone in 4 days. He said it simply, the way people say things that are too large to say dramatically. I sold the claim and left, drifted south, ended up working for Holloway. She sat with this information and gave it the weight it deserved. I'm sorry, she said. That is a real loss. Yes, he said. And you carry it as an instruction, not information, she said softly. He turned and looked at her, and she saw the moment her own words, turned back on him, landed in his chest. He had expected her to offer sympathy and had received something more useful, and she could see him reckoning with that. Maybe, he said, maybe I have. You came here anyway, she said, knowing what my father's fever looked like. That took something. He did not answer that, but she saw his jaw shift and she counted the conversation as settled. She stood. Get some sleep, she said, as she had the night before. We need to be in Millhaven at the county land office when it opens. And I want to stop at the lawyer's office as well. He looked up at her. You have a lawyer. I have several documents that require a lawyer's review, she said. Mr. Esperanza in Millhaven. He is thorough and he does not condescend to female clients. Is that rare? Luke asked. Remarkably, Elvira said. She went inside and lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling for a while before she slept, thinking about what he had told her and what she had told him, and whether the strange new sensation in her chest was a problem or merely a development. She decided it was a development. She would observe it and take notes. They rode to Millhaven the next morning, taking the good horses, who were better rested now that the water situation had improved. The ride was 16 miles, and they did most of it in a comfortable near silence that was different from the silence of strangers, fuller and more specific. At one point, a jackrabbit burst from a creosote bush directly under Elvira's horse's feet, and the horse shied hard left. Elvira rode it out without drama, sitting deep in the saddle, hand light on the reins, bringing the animal back to center in about 4 strides. It was not a difficult recovery for a skilled rider. She did not think about it, but she caught Luke's expression as he watched it, and his eyes had gone wide for just a moment before he composed himself, and she understood that he had expected her to struggle, or at least to wobble, and had been prepared to intervene, and she had not needed him to. You ride like that all the time? He asked. Yes, she said. Where did you learn? He seemed genuinely to want to know. My father taught me until I was 10, she said. After that I taught myself. She looked at him. I spent a considerable amount of time in the saddle reading about things I wanted to know how to do. Then I put the book away and did them. She paused. I have read every book on horsemanship the county library carries, and 3 that I purchased myself, and 1 that I borrowed from a vaquero family near Las Cruces who were kind enough to host me for a week when I was 17. Luke Fletcher stared at her. She watched him arrive at the conclusion that she had, at 17, traveled alone to Las Cruces to apprentice herself to expert riders for a week, and saw the exact moment he decided this did not surprise him at all, which surprised her. You're the most capable person I've ever met, he said. He said it with the directness of a man stating an observable fact, which was how she preferred things to be stated. That may be true, she said. It is also not relevant to the task at hand. It's relevant to me, he said. She looked at the road ahead. Her horse's ears were forward and the morning was still cool and the mountains were very clear to the north. We will discuss relevance another time, she said. In Millhaven, she moved with the kind of focused efficiency that tended to startle people who had expectations about how a young woman operated in public. She went first to the county surveyor's office with her documentation of the cistern. The county surveyor, a thin man named Albright who wore reading spectacles and an expression of permanent mild distress, looked at her geological survey, looked at her photographs, looked at her sketch of the cistern structure and its approximate dimensions, and looked at the Spanish map. He took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Miss Sawyer, he said, where did you get this training? Books, she said, and practice and thinking. He blinked at her. I see. He put his spectacles back on. This is professional-grade work. I will need to send my own man out to verify as a matter of official record, but I see no reason this won't stand. Good, she said. And the registration of the water right. I'll file it today, he said. The Sawyer property will have primary claim to that water source as of today's date. She left his office with a copy of the filing and went directly to see Manuel Esperanza, the lawyer, who was a small, precise man of about 50 with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of careful intelligence that showed in how he listened before he spoke. She laid out everything: the Spanish map, the hidden cistern, the blocked drainage on the Holloway property, the blocked diversion of the Rio Perdido, the stone with the initial and date, the pattern of Renner acquisitions. Manuel Esperanza listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "You have photographs." "I do," she said. "And this stone with the initial and date, where is it?" "Still in place on the Holloway property," she said, "which I acknowledge is now Renner property and I accessed without permission." He waved this away. "You discovered evidence of interference with your water rights on adjacent land. There is case law there, though it is not clean." He tapped his fingers on his desk. "The more significant matter is this." He looked at the photographed diversion on the Rio Perdido. "This is clearly on your land. This is clearly intentional. And this connects, through the pattern you have documented, to a series of purchases that suggest a coordinated fraud against property owners in this county." "Yes," Elvira said. "This is federal territory," Esperanza said. "The United States Marshal's Office has jurisdiction. I can write the complaint. I need your signed statement, and I need the statement of any corroborating witness." He looked past her to Luke, who had been sitting in the chair against the wall with his hat on his knee, listening to everything. "You are Luke Fletcher," Luke said. "I worked the Holloway property for 4 years. I saw the drainage manipulation before the sale. I can give you a full statement." Esperanza looked at Elvira. "You came prepared," he said. There was a note of approval in his voice that he did not entirely hide. "I am always prepared," she said. They gave their statements. They signed the documents. They left Esperanza's office at noon with the assurance that the complaint to the marshal's office in Santa Fe would go out on the afternoon stage. On the way to the livery to collect their horses, Luke stopped at the general store and came out with a paper bag that he handed to Elvira without comment. Inside was hard candy, lemon flavor, and a small jar of preserved peaches. She looked at him. "You haven't eaten since this morning," he said. "Neither have I." She ate 3 of the lemon candies and put the jar of peaches in her saddlebag and felt something warm and inconvenient shift in her chest at the thoughtfulness of it, the way he had noticed without her telling him, the way he had addressed it without making a production of it. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said, and swung up into his saddle. They were 10 miles out of Millhaven, heading east toward the ranch, when Ezra Renner and 2 of his men came up fast from a side track and blocked the road. Renner was about 40, heavyset, with the particular confident unpleasantness of a man who had learned early that wealth forgave ugliness of character. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who believed the ground arranged itself around his convenience. "Miss Sawyer," he said. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that was meant to be comforting and landed instead as threatening. "I've been meaning to call on your father." "My father is not receiving visitors," Elvira said. Her voice was entirely level. "Sick man," Renner said. He shook his head in performed sympathy. "Terrible thing, this drought. Heard your well went dry." He tilted his head. "I'd like to make your father an offer on the property. Generous one, given the circumstances. Be ashamed to lose it to bank pressure." "There is no bank pressure," Elvira said. "And the Sawyer property is not for sale." Renner's smile stayed, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Water's a hard thing to replace in August, Miss Sawyer." "It is," she agreed. "Though we find we have more than we expected, the cistern is quite productive." The silence that followed was precise and crystalline and very satisfying. Renner's smile disappeared. "Cistern," he said. "Spanish colonial," she said. "Over 200 years old. Properly documented and registered with the county this very morning. The Sawyer property has a recorded water right as of today's date." She looked at him with the steady attention she brought to geological surveys and species identification, and all things that required accurate observation. We also filed a complaint with the United States Marshal's Office today, relating to interference with natural drainage and water sources on multiple properties in this county, including ours. One of Renner's men shifted in his saddle. Luke had not moved, but Elvira was aware of him beside her with the precise awareness she might have for a loaded rifle, not threatening but ready. "You're making a serious accusation," Renner said. His voice had gone flat. "I am making a documented accusation," Elvira said. "There is a difference." The documentation includes photographs, measured surveys, geological analysis, and a stone bearing an initial and a date that connects to your family. Renner looked at Luke. "Fletcher," he said, "you're mixed up in something that doesn't benefit you." "I'm mixed up in the truth," Luke said, "which I find generally benefits everyone except the people who prefer things hidden." Renner held the silence for several more seconds. Then he turned his horse. His men followed. They rode away down the side track without another word. Elvira watched them go. She felt the first loosening of a tension she had been carrying for days, like a knot beginning to release. "He'll try something else," Luke said. "Probably," she agreed, "but not today. And by the time the marshal acts, there will be a record that makes any attempt at further interference very expensive for him." She looked after the retreating horses. "The thing about a man who operates through hidden means is that he loses most of his power once the hiding is done." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "You enjoyed that," he said. She almost smiled. "Somewhat," she admitted. He did smile, full and real, the one that changed his face. And she decided then, in the October light, that she was no longer going to pretend the observation was purely academic. They rode back to the ranch and arrived in the golden late afternoon. Hank Sawyer was sitting on the porch, not just sitting up, sitting on the porch in the rocking chair with a cup of coffee. Elvira stopped her horse and looked at him. The fever had clearly broken. His color was still poor and he was thin around the jaw from days of not eating, but his eyes were clear and focused, and his posture was the posture of a man coming back to himself. "Good day?" he asked. "Productive," she said. She told him everything, all of it, sitting on the porch steps while Luke saw to the horses. She laid it out with the same systematic clarity she brought to everything, and Hank Sawyer listened with the gradually changing expression of a man who is revising his understanding of a situation he thought he had a handle on. "Renner," he said when she finished. "I dealt with his father, bad man. Apparently the son is worse." "The son has a system," she said. "His father may have had impulse. The son has planning." Hank was quiet. The evening settled around them, warm and still, the cattle calm in the southern pasture now that the water was again available to them. "The cistern," Hank said finally. "Your grandfather bought this land in '61. Never found any cistern." "It was deliberately concealed," Elvira said. "There was a capstone mortared down and the map was hidden in the hearth." "I knew about the loose stone," Hank said slowly. "I always meant to fix it, never looked behind it." "You would have found the map if you had," she said. "But you found it," he said, "because you looked." He was quiet again. Then, with the deliberate emphasis of a man who does not often make formal pronouncements, "Your mother would be—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "You are something, Elvira. You have always been something." She looked at her hands. "I have always been trying to be useful," she said. "More than that," he said firmly. Luke came around the corner of the house and stopped at the edge of the porch, clearly unsure whether he was interrupting. Hank looked at him with the assessing gaze he had turned on Luke before, and this time something in his expression settled. "You going to be around a while, Fletcher?" he asked. Luke glanced at Elvira. She kept her expression neutral, but she felt the question land in her chest and bounce around in a way she did not attempt to control. "If there's work and I'm wanted," Luke said. "There's always work on a ranch," Hank said. "And a man who helped my daughter in good faith without making a fool of himself about it is wanted." He picked up his coffee. "Supper at 6, he added. "Elvira, your cooking has been keeping me alive. Tonight I want to try to get to the table." She looked at him. "If you feel strong enough." "Strong enough," he said. "Almost." She went inside to start supper, and as she moved through the kitchen, through the familiar routine of it, she heard Luke and her father talking on the porch, their voices low and steady, two men finding the registers of conversation, and the sound of it settled something in her that had been unsettled for years without her fully acknowledging it. In mid-August, 2 weeks after the cistern was found, the United States Deputy Marshal arrived from Santa Fe. His name was Garrett, and he was a quiet, methodical man in his 40s who wrote everything down and asked very specific questions and gave away very little of his thinking. He spent 4 days on and around the Sawyer property, rode over to the Holloway Renner property with 2 of his own men and Elvira's photographic evidence, and visited 3 other ranching families in the county, who, once they heard that someone had made a formal complaint, came forward with their own accounts of water trouble preceding Renner offers. Elvira sat in on every interview that she was permitted to, and took notes, and answered questions with the exact precision that Garrett's approach seemed to appreciate. On the 4th evening, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with Elvira and her father, Hank by now largely recovered, still thin but upright in himself, and said, "I am issuing a warrant for Ezra Renner on charges of willful interference with water rights and property fraud. I will also be recommending a federal investigation into the land purchase at the Holloway property and 3 others." He paused. "Miss Sawyer, your documentation was the foundation of this. Without it, I would have had testimony but no physical evidence." Elvira nodded. "The photographs were critical," she said, "and the stone with the initial." "That stone," Garrett said with something approaching admiration, "is going to be exhibit number 1. He stood, gathering his papers. "There is a possibility of civil remedy as well. The Holloway family may have legal recourse to contest the sale on grounds of fraud, and if they prevail, the property would revert." He put his hat on. "I'll see myself out." Hank waited until the sound of Garrett's horse had faded down the road. Then he looked at Elvira. "Civil remedy," he said. "For the Holloway family," she said. "Not for us. We kept the ranch." "And exposed a fraudulent scheme that's been operating across multiple properties," Hank said. He shook his head. "When I sent you to that library the first time when you were, what, 8, 9, she said. "I thought you were going to read novels," he said. "I thought it was a phase." He was looking at her with an expression that contained, among other things, a certain retrospective gratitude for being wrong. "You are something else, Ellie." Luke had been in the doorway. He came in and sat down, and the kitchen had the feeling of a space that had been earned, comfortable in the way that only comes after genuine difficulty. "What happens to you now?" Hank asked Luke, not unkindly. It was a real question, one man taking an interest in another's situation. "I've been thinking about that," Luke said. He glanced at Elvira briefly, with an economy of expression that she had learned to read in the past 2 weeks, a glance that said more than its duration suggested. "There might be work on a ranch that needs a steady hand while its owner recovers." "Might be," Hank said. He was looking between them with the shrewd eyes of a man who had ranched long enough to know when something was growing slowly and quietly, and required the same patience as anything that grows in dry ground. He said no more about it, which Elvira appreciated. The days that followed had a rhythm that felt new to her but not foreign, as if she had been moving toward it for a long time without knowing the destination. Luke worked the ranch with a competence that needed no direction, the kind of instinctive understanding of livestock and land that matched her own in different registers. He understood cattle. She understood water and soil and the patterns underneath. Between them, the ranch came back to itself with a steadiness that felt, to Elvira, like something she had never quite had before. Not rescue. She had not been rescued. She had done the essential thing herself, found the water, documented the crime, protected the land. Luke had helped, materially and genuinely, but the central act had been hers, and they both knew it and neither of them pretended otherwise, which was the thing she found she could not stop thinking about. He never pretended otherwise. In a world where most men arranged the furniture of their own importance over the inconvenient reality of her competence, Luke Fletcher simply did not do that. He looked at what she had actually done and said what he actually thought about it. And what he thought was that it was impressive, and his being impressed did not diminish him in her eyes. It enlarged him. It was the end of August, the 30th, a Tuesday, and Elvira was at the cistern taking her weekly measurement of the water level, kneeling at the edge with her measuring line, when she heard Luke come up behind her. She did not turn around. She finished the measurement, recorded it in her notebook, capped her pen. "Level is stable," she said. "In fact, it may have risen slightly since last week, which suggests the underground feed is responding to some residual pressure from the northern snowpack, which means it will be more active in spring." She put the notebook in her satchel. "This cistern is going to outlast everything else on this property by 100 years. "Good," Luke said. He sat down on the edge of the cistern the way he sat on everything, with the settled ease of a man who is comfortable in his own body. "Elvira," she turned and looked at him. The August afternoon was golden and the light on the southern pasture was extraordinary, the way late summer light always was in this part of New Mexico territory, lying heavy and warm over the dry grass. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I came here for the reasons I told you, but they weren't the only reasons." He paused. "I've been watching this ranch and the woman who runs it for 4 years, across a fence line that I told myself was fixed in place for good reasons. I told myself it was because I was working for Holloway and it wouldn't be right to—" He stopped. "I told myself a lot of things. Most of them were excuses." Elvira sat down beside him, with the same deliberate choice she had made on the porch that first evening. "You were not over the loss," she said. "I was not," he agreed. "For a long time I wasn't, but that's in me and it'll always be in me. It's not a wall anymore. It's just part of the country of where I've been." He looked at her steadily. "You showed me something about that. The thing you said about fear being information, not instruction." "I said that about my own fear," she said. "I know," he said, "but it applied." She was quiet for a moment, the sound of the cattle drifting over from the north pasture, the distant call of a cactus wren from the direction of the creek bed. "Luke," she said, "I need you to understand something about me." "Tell me," he said. "I am not a woman who will become less of what I am for the sake of any person or situation," she said. "I will not stop reading, stop surveying, stop thinking, stop having opinions, stop being capable, stop being myself. I am aware that this is not universally appealing." "I know," he said. "I am also aware that I am deeply, inconveniently fond of you," she said, "and that this began approximately the moment you picked up a shovel without asking why." He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a precise catalog entry for, something between wonder and certainty, as if he had been looking for the shape of something for a long time and had just seen it clearly for the first time. "I think I fell in love with you," he said, "when I handed you that letter and you read the Spanish notation without blinking." She felt the warmth of it move through her, clean and real, nothing like the dramatic and convenient emotions she had read about in the novels the library carried. This was quieter and more structural, like water finding its level. "Do not show," she said, quoting the hidden map. He laughed, and the laugh broke into a smile, and the smile did what it always did to his face, burned away the careful exterior and left something warm and specific and entirely directed at her. "I think I have to show," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, because she was a woman who made decisions based on evidence and the evidence was compelling, and because the afternoon light on the southern pasture was as beautiful as anything she had ever seen, and because she was 23 years old and the cistern was found and her father was recovering and the land was safe, and she had done all of that, and now she was choosing this. He kissed her back, careful and then not careful, warm and real, with the particular solidity of a person who is entirely present in what they are doing. When they parted, he was smiling still. "I expected you to be more methodical about this," he said. "I was extremely methodical," she said. "I have been observing and taking notes for 2 weeks. And your conclusion, highly favorable," she said. "Margin of error minimal." He laughed again, and she thought she might spend a significant portion of her life engineering situations that produced that particular sound. September came to the Sawyer ranch with the first easing of the heat, the nights dropping to bearable, the days still warm but no longer punishing. The cattle put weight back on. The horses brightened. Hank Sawyer came back to full capacity, which meant he was up before dawn, checking the stock himself, arguing with Elvira about the fall roundup schedule, and treating Luke with the gradual warmth of a man who has decided someone has earned their place. Ezra Renner was arrested in the first week of September, apprehended in Santa Fe by the deputy marshal and 2 federal agents. The news came by wire to Millhaven and was in the territorial newspaper by the following Thursday. 3 other Renner associates were also charged. The investigation, Esperanza wrote in a letter to Elvira, would likely take 2 years to work through the courts, but the early indications were strong. The Holloway family, Esperanza further wrote, had engaged counsel to contest the sale. Their case was, in his professional opinion, solid. Elvira filed this letter with the rest of her documentation and made a note to follow up in 6 months. The fall roundup was, by any measure, a success. Luke worked alongside the 2 new hands Hank had hired in September, a pair of brothers named Anyate from a family in the area, reliable and hardworking, and the 4 of them moved the herd with the efficiency of a well-organized operation. Elvira rode fence lines on the 2nd and 3rd day, her sure-footed mare navigating the terrain with the ease of long familiarity, checking every post and wire for the winter preparation. On the 4th day, she found Luke repairing a gate in the southern pasture fence near the cistern. He was working with the focused attention he gave to physical tasks, precise and economical, and he did not hear her approach until she was almost at the fence. He looked up. He smiled. The smile came immediately, without the brief lag of social arrangement that most people had, direct and entirely genuine. "You've been riding since dawn," he said. "So have you," she said. "I haven't been doing it on a horse with a cracked left rear shoe," he said. She pulled up and swung down and checked the shoe. He was right. The nail had loosened on the rear left, not dangerous yet, but it would need attention before the next day's work. "How did you see that from here?" she asked. "I watched how she stepped when you came in," he said. "Slight hesitation on the left rear. Consistent." He went back to the gate. "Take her in, I'll finish here." She looked at him, at the gate, at the mare's shoe. "I am capable of riding with a loose shoe," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not suggesting you ride with it. I'm suggesting you take her in, nail the shoe, and come back. I'll be here." She led the mare back toward the barn with the awareness that she was smiling, which she had decided to simply allow rather than analyze. On a cool October evening, with the stars beginning to show in the early dark and the smell of the first real autumn in the air, Luke asked Hank Sawyer's permission to court Elvira formally. Hank said, "Son, I'd suggest you ask Elvira that question directly, because she's the one who'll decide it, and if you can't figure that out, then you haven't been paying attention." Luke, who had been paying considerable attention, went directly to Elvira and asked. She said yes, with the economy of a woman who has already made the decision and is simply confirming it. The formal courtship of Elvira Sawyer and Luke Fletcher was somewhat unusual by the standards of the territory in 1887, which was to say it looked more like a partnership than a performance. They rode out together. They worked together. They read together in the evenings, she at the kitchen table with her geological volumes, and he with the newspaper from Santa Fe, occasionally reading aloud to each other the things they found interesting, which turned out to be many of the same things, which surprised neither of them particularly. He helped her expand her water survey of the Sawyer property, learning enough of the basic methodology under her teaching that he could run a probe rod grid independently while she worked on the analysis. She discovered, in turn, that he had a detailed and practical knowledge of livestock health and breeding that complemented her land management work in ways she had not anticipated. They argued sometimes, Real arguments about real things, with the equal force collision of two people who both think clearly and are not accustomed to yielding on points they have reasoned through. The arguments resolved, usually, in one of them conceding a point they had been convinced on, or in a combined position that neither had started with. Both of them found this deeply satisfying, though neither said so explicitly. By November, it was clear to everyone at the Sawyer ranch, including the Onyate brothers, who were perceptive men, that the only outstanding question was when, not whether. Luke proposed on a Wednesday in December in the kitchen, with no ceremony, setting a ring on the table between them while they were working through the winter feed calculations and saying, "I want to marry you, Elvira, if that's something you want." She looked at the ring. It was a simple band with a small turquoise stone, and she recognized it as turquoise from the deposits near the mine south of Millhaven, which had been worked for centuries, and the recognition that he had chosen something local, something specific to this land, landed in her chest with a precision she felt in her hands. "Yes," she said, "that is something I want." She put the ring on and went back to the feed calculations, and Luke sat down across from her and returned to his half of the figures, and somewhere in the middle of the next column she looked up and found him watching her with the full, unguarded warmth that she kept in that specific drawer where she kept the most important things. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud to him. "I know," he said. "I love you." He said it with the same matter-of-fact certainty he brought to stating observable truths, because for him it was an observable truth, one he had observed for months and had been entirely certain of since August, since the cistern, since the moment he watched her lay a map on the table and begin to tell him what the world actually looked like underneath. They married in February of 1888 in the small Methodist church in Millhaven, before a congregation that included Hank Sawyer, the Onyate brothers, Manuel Esperanza, the county surveyor Albright, and a considerable portion of the ranching community who had followed the Renner story with the intense interest of people whose own futures had been implicated in it. The Holloway family came, too. Esperanza had been right about their case. The fraud conviction against Renner had moved faster than the civil case, and the weight of the criminal findings had put significant pressure on the civil proceedings. By February, the Holloway property was in the process of being returned to the Holloway family, at no cost to them beyond legal fees. Old Mr. Holloway shook Luke's hand after the ceremony with both of his own. "Good man," he said. "You spotted that drainage trouble first." "Elvira documented it," Luke said. "The pair of you together, then," Holloway said, looking between them. "Formidable." Elvira accepted this as the accurate characterization it was. After the ceremony, after the small celebration at the church hall with the food that the women of the congregation had provided, the cake made with real sugar that someone had brought from the mercantile, after the toasts and the well wishes and the handshakes, Luke and Elvira rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light. The land was winter brown, and the sky was the particular clear blue that New Mexico territory produced in February, sharp and cold and beautiful. The horses moved well. The cistern, she knew, was still full. She had checked it 3 days ago. "Elvira Fletcher," Luke said, trying the combination. "I am keeping Sawyer," she said. "Elvira Sawyer Fletcher, both." "I know," he said. He had known she would. He had not proposed any other arrangement. "I was just trying the sound of it." "The full sound?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Elvira Sawyer Fletcher. It sounds like someone you wouldn't want to argue with unnecessarily." "Accurate," she said. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, their gloved fingers locking together, riding the last mile home in the winter light with that particular warmth between their palms that defied the February cold. Spring came, and with it, the realization of everything Elvira had predicted about the cistern and the underground water system. The flow increased markedly in March, fed by the snowmelt from the northern ranges, and the Sawyer property had an abundance of water while the surrounding area was still emerging from the previous summer's hardship. She filed a supplementary survey with the county, documenting the spring levels, and began sketching a plan for a second cistern at a different geological location on the property that her survey suggested might yield a similar find. Hank watched her working on this plan at the kitchen table one April evening with the expression of a man witnessing something he has understood too late. "There's another one," he said. "Possibly," she said. The limestone formation runs northeast to southwest across the property. The first cistern sits on the southern end of it. If the fracture system continues, there may be a natural reservoir toward the northeast corner as well, near the grazing land, Hank said, which would eliminate the water hauling distance for the summer grazing rotation by half, she confirmed. Hank looked at Luke, who was by the fire reading and had clearly already been through this conversation earlier. Luke looked back at Hank with an expression that said quietly, "Yes, I know, I live here too." "Is she always like this?" Hank asked. "As far as I can tell," Luke said, "she is always like this." "Good," Hank said, with a finality that closed the discussion. They found the second cistern in May, which was a year to the month since Elvira had begun her water table decline documentation that had set everything in motion. It was smaller than the first, perhaps 10 feet deep, but fed by the same fracture system and just as cold and clean. It had not been deliberately hidden. It appeared never to have been discovered at all. Elvira stood at the edge of it with her probe rod and her notebook, and the particular internal stillness that she felt in moments of confirmation, when the hypothesis proved out and the world showed itself to be the shape she had reasoned it to be. Luke was beside her. He had become very good with the probe rod, she had to admit, not as intuitive as she was, but methodical and precise and willing to learn, which in the long run served better than intuition alone. "You knew it was here," he said. "I suspected," she corrected. "You knew," he said. "You had that expression, the one you get when you're already 3 steps ahead of the evidence." She looked at him. "I do not have an expression." "You have many expressions," he said. "I've catalogued most of them." He was smiling. "The geologist expression is my personal favorite. It involves your chin going slightly up and your eyes doing this thing." He gestured vaguely in the direction of her eyes. "That is not a real description," she said. "It's a highly accurate description," he said. "Ask your father." She turned back to the cistern. "This one needs a proper cover," she said. "We will need dressed stone and lime mortar. I want to document the masonry technique used in the first one and replicate it. A proper Spanish colonial cistern cover, properly fitted." She was already calculating. "It should hold for another 200 years if it's done right." "Then we'd better do it right," he said. She had known she loved him in August at the dry well. She had understood it fully in September at the broken gate. She had been completely certain of it in December, at the kitchen table with the feed calculations. But here, in May, at the edge of a cistern they had found together through a combination of her knowledge and his steady presence, she felt it in a way that was not about certainty or analysis or evidence. She simply felt it, the full warmth of it, the enormity of it, with her notebooks in her satchel and the probe rod in her hand, and the New Mexico sky above and the good water below, and him beside her. She reached out and took his hand. He held it without comment, without making a production of the rarity of the gesture from her, because he understood that she showed her feelings in the way the land showed its water, which was not on the surface but deep and real and lasting. In early June, Elvira told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with her coffee, with the same directness she brought to everything, because this was information and she shared information as soon as she had it. Luke set down his cup. He looked at her with an expression she had not yet catalogued, something new, something that was past all the varieties of warmth and admiration she had documented over the past 10 months, something larger and more fundamental, as if the world had just expanded in a direction he had not expected, and the expansion was welcome beyond his ability to speak. He stood. He crossed the kitchen. He cupped her face in his hands, careful and certain, and held her and looked at her for a long moment in the morning light. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he asked. "Quite well," she said. "I have been monitoring the situation for 2 weeks. Everything is within normal parameters." He smiled at that. "Of course you have," he said. He held her for a while, her face against his chest, his hands in her hair, the morning coming through the kitchen window, and she let herself simply be held, which was not something she allowed often, but which she found she wanted very much in this particular moment. "A boy or a girl?" he said, not really asking. "I have no way of predicting that," she said, "though I have thoughts about each name." He laughed against her hair. "Of course you do." Hank Sawyer, when told, sat quietly for a moment, and then cleared his throat 4 times and poured himself a cup of coffee that he did not drink and looked out the window at the southern pasture for a while before turning back and saying, with the gruffness of a man whose emotions are too large for his usual vocabulary, "That's a fine thing. That's a very fine thing." The summer of 1888 was different from the summer of 1887 in almost every particular. The water was abundant. The cisterns held, the cattle were healthy. The Renner trial had concluded with a conviction and a significant fine, and a prohibition from purchasing land in the territory for 10 years, and the news had run through the ranching community like clean water through limestone, slow and certain, and changing everything it touched. Elvira managed the ranch through the summer with the same intensity she brought to everything, adjusting her physical work as her condition required, which was less adjustment than most people expected, and more than she would have preferred. Luke was, in this as in everything, clear-eyed and practical, neither hovering nor absent, present in the specific ways that were useful, which was all she had ever wanted from anyone. She also used the summer to begin writing up her survey methodology in a systematic form, at the encouragement of Manuel Esperanza, who had a contact at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and believed her documented techniques for identifying subsurface water sources in limestone-dominant geography had academic and practical value beyond the Sawyer property. "The university is interested in applied geology," Esperanza told her on a visit in July. "There is a growing field, particularly in territories where water access is the defining survival factor." "I know," she said. She had been reading the relevant publications for 3 years. She wrote the survey methodology in the evenings, at the kitchen table, and Luke read each section as she completed it and gave her his observations from the perspective of someone who had applied her methods in the field. The collaboration was not for his sake, she knew. It was because his field observations had genuine value, the practical knowledge of a man who understood the land's physical realities. She incorporated his notes with the same lack of ego she brought to incorporating good information from any source. The document, when finished in September, was 43 pages long. She sent it to the university contact Esperanza had identified, a professor named Armitage, with a cover letter that was direct and specific and not apologetic for either the quality of the work or the sex of its author. She received a reply in November that used the words "significant contribution" and "professional quality," and "we would welcome further correspondence." She filed this with her other documentation and began a follow-up paper on the geological characteristics of the 2 Sawyer cisterns. Their son was born in December of 1888, 2 weeks after Christmas, on a cold night when the stars were bright and the ranch was quiet, and Luke held her hand through the whole of it, steady and present as the land itself. The local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Domings, managed the birth with skill and no unnecessary drama. They named him Henry Alejandro Fletcher, Henry for Elvira's father, Alejandro for Don Alejandro Vila, the man who had built the first cistern 2 centuries before, whose work had saved the ranch without his ever knowing it would be needed. Hank Sawyer held his grandson the morning after the birth and did not say anything for a long time. His eyes were the kind of bright that has nothing to do with illness and everything to do with feeling. "Henry," he said finally. "Henry Alejandro," Elvira said. "The second name matters." "The second name matters," Hank agreed. He looked at the baby with the careful attention of a man who is seeing something he recognizes. "He has your mother's forehead," he said. "I know," Elvira said. Luke was on the other side of the bed, watching his wife watch their son, with an expression that he made no attempt to arrange into anything less than what it was, which was complete and unguarded love. For the child, for the woman, for the life that had come to him so unexpectedly through a drought and a hidden cistern and a woman who read geological surveys the way other people read novels. He reached across and took her hand. She was already reaching for his. By the spring of 1889, the Sawyer Ranch had a full complement of hands, 4 working the land, 2 new ones recommended by the Oñate brothers. The northeast cistern had been properly covered in the Spanish colonial style Elvira had designed, and the spring flow was even stronger than the previous year. The main well, the original one that had gone dry in August of '87, had recovered with the improvement of the regional water table and was producing modestly again, though Elvira had made clear in her survey documentation that the underlying aquifer was shallow and should not be relied upon as primary. The primary was the hidden cistern, the one she had found, the forgotten one, the one that had been waiting beneath the earth for someone who knew how to look. Hank Sawyer's health was fully restored, and he worked the ranch the way he always had, with the stubborn persistence of a man for whom stopping was simply not in the vocabulary. He and Luke had developed the easy communication of men who work together well, not always agreeing, but always clear about what they thought and why. Elvira received a second letter from Professor Armitage at the University of New Mexico, this one asking if she would be willing to review a student survey of water sources in the Chilerosa Basin that the professor was supervising. She wrote back saying she would be happy to review it and attached 3 pages of preliminary observations based on the geological profile she had read about the basin in previous publications. The professor's response, which arrived in April, was 2 pages of engaged intellectual discourse and an invitation to correspond regularly. She wrote back the same evening. Luke found her at the kitchen table, as he so often did, writing with the focused intensity that he had come to understand as one of her natural states, as natural as the way she read the land or rode a horse or made decisions without hesitation. He set a cup of tea beside her because he knew she preferred tea in the evenings now, and because this was the kind of knowledge a person accumulated about another person they loved, the small specific preferences that made up the texture of a shared life. She looked up. She looked at the tea, then at him. "Thank you," she said. "Who are you writing to?" he asked. "A professor at the university," she said. "He wants my opinion on a student survey of the Chilerosa Basin water sources." Luke pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "What's your opinion?" She showed him the preliminary notes. He read them with the focused attention he gave to everything she showed him, asking one question about the probe rod methodology and making an observation about the seasonal variance data that she had not yet addressed but had been planning to. "That point about the seasonal variance," she said. "I'm going to put that in." She wrote it in the margin first, then integrated it into the text. He watched her write. She had a distinctive hand, clear and exact, every letter formed with precision, the kind of handwriting that suggested a mind that was ordered down to its smallest components. The baby was asleep in the next room. The ranch was quiet. The evening was warm for April, the first real warmth of the year, and the kitchen window was open a few inches, letting in the smell of the desert after the previous day's rain, the particular clean mineral smell that she had loved since childhood. "Elvira," he said. She looked up. "I want to tell you something," he said. She set her pen down. She gave him her full attention, which when she gave it was entirely complete. He had learned this. "When Elvira Sawyer Fletcher was paying attention to you, you felt it like the sun. When I came to this ranch last August," he said, "I told myself it was for the right reasons, the information about Renner, making sure you had what you needed to protect yourself. And those were real reasons. But the real reason underneath all of them was that I had been watching this ranch and this woman for 4 years, and I had been running out of excuses not to come. She was quiet, listening. "I want you to know," he said, "that nothing about you has been what I expected. You are more than I expected in every direction. You are better and more difficult and more interesting and more—" He paused, searching for it. "You are more real than anything I have met in this world. And I am grateful every day that the well went dry and gave me a reason to stop being a coward." She looked at him for a long time. She was a woman who liked to think before she spoke, who preferred precision to immediacy, but what she felt in this moment was not something that wanted precision. It was something that wanted to be said directly. "I love you," she said, "and I do not say things I do not mean. Everything I have built in my life I have built by looking at the world as it actually is, not as I wish it to be. What I see when I look at you is the most remarkable man I have ever known. Not because you are without flaws, because when you are wrong, you revise. Because when I am right, you acknowledge it. Because you came to this ranch without being asked and you picked up a shovel and you did not ask why." She paused. "And because every morning I wake up knowing that the person beside me respects everything that I am, and that is the rarest water in the driest desert I have ever surveyed." He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her with that expression, the one without a catalog entry, the one that was past all the others. Then he said, "That is the most romantic thing that has ever been said to me, and it involved a geological metaphor." She smiled. "I am who I am," she said. "You are," he said, "every extraordinary inch of it." He reached across the table. She took his hand. The kitchen was warm, the baby was sleeping, the cistern was full, and the land outside was alive with the first green of the year after the first good rain. The stars were beginning to show through the April dusk, more of them every minute, the way they always did in the clear sky of New Mexico territory, coming out one by one until suddenly there were more than could be counted. Elvira Sawyer Fletcher looked out the window at them for a moment, the way a person looks at something genuinely beautiful without calculating or cataloging, just receiving it. Then she picked up her pen because there was still work to do, and Luke poured himself a cup of coffee and read his newspaper and asked her, occasionally, what she was thinking. And she told him, fully and without simplification, and he listened and asked his precise questions and made his useful observations. In the summer of 1890, their daughter arrived, born in July on a morning when the temperature was climbing and the cistern was producing at peak capacity. They named her Catalina Vila Fletcher, the surname Vila honoring the man who had built the cistern, the man who had built the hidden thing that saved the land, whose name otherwise would have vanished entirely into the past. Hank Sawyer held Catalina and said, "2 grandchildren before I'm 60. I thought ranching was what I'd leave behind. Turns out it's these." He looked at Elvira. "And you?" "And Luke," she said. "And Luke," he agreed. He looked at Luke with the expression he had been developing for 2 years, the warm, specific regard of a man who has accepted another man into the place where such regard lives. "Good people," he said, "the both of you." Little Henry was 18 months old, beginning to walk with the unsteady confidence of someone discovering balance, and he looked at the new baby with the solemn attention of a person encountering something significant and unknown. He looked up at his father. Luke crouched down beside him. "That's your sister," Luke said. "Catalina." Henry considered this. "Cat," he said, which was not quite the name but was a fair effort. "Catalina," Luke said again. "Cat," Henry said firmly. Catalina, as it turned out, was called Cat by her family for the rest of her life, which was not what Elvira had intended, but which she acknowledged was perfectly appropriate for the daughter who, by the time she was 2, could outrun any child in the territory and had no obvious fear of anything larger than herself. Elvira watched her children grow in the same way she watched everything, with careful and loving attention, noting what they were drawn to, what they were good at, what they needed. Henry showed an early aptitude for the animals, watching how they moved and what they needed with an instinctive sympathy that reminded her of Luke. Catalina showed an early and uncompromising interest in how everything worked, disassembling any object that could be disassembled, and generally being able to put it back together. "She gets the curiosity from you," Luke said. "She gets the directness from you," Elvira said. "I'm not that direct," he said. She looked at him. "I'm somewhat direct," he said. In 1891, the University of New Mexico published a monograph on water source identification in limestone-dominant southwestern geology. The author was listed as E. Sawyer Fletcher, ranch surveyor and independent geologist, New Mexico Territory. Professor Armitage wrote an introduction that described the methodology contained therein as a practical contribution of rare clarity and rigor, developed through years of field work under genuine frontier conditions. Elvira received 6 copies by post. She put one on the shelf in the study, one in her documentation files, gave one to her father, and kept one on the kitchen table where she could refer to it, not out of vanity, but because the work was genuinely useful and she continued to use it. Luke put his copy in his saddlebag. She asked him why. "Because sometimes I'm out on the land and I want to check a specific point of methodology," he said. "And you're usually in the study." She looked at him for a long moment. "Luke Fletcher," she said. "Elvira Sawyer Fletcher," he said. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, which startled him because she was the one who kissed him first exactly as often as she kissed him second, which was one of the things he found specifically wonderful about her. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you." He held her for a moment, her forehead against his jaw, the afternoon sun coming through the window, the children somewhere outside with Hank, the ranch settled and alive and present. "Every day I'm grateful for August. For the drought." She said, "For the drought," he confirmed, "and for the woman who went looking for what was underneath." She pulled back and looked at him. She was 30 years old in 1894 when she thought back to this moment, writing in her study while the children were at their lessons, and Luke was riding the fence line, and her father was in the garden that he had started in his semi-retirement. And she thought about all of it, the dry well and the Spanish map, and the capstone and the cold water rising in the lantern light. And she thought about Luke's face when she had shown him the cistern, the shock of genuine impression. And she thought about the rope burn on her hands and how she had not stopped. She had not stopped. She had looked at the dry surface and she had known there was something underneath, because there was always something underneath, if you knew how to look. She picked up her pen and wrote at the top of the new page, "The second monograph will address the northeastern quadrant geological data. In my experience, the most significant finding is rarely where the surface suggests it will be. The work is in the looking." Outside, she could hear Henry calling to the dog and Kat responding with some opinion about what the dog should be doing instead, and Luke's horse coming around the south side of the barn, and her father saying something in the garden that she could not make out, but that had the cadence of contentment. The well had run dry in August, and she had looked underneath, and the land had given up its secret, and the secret had been enough. More than enough. The cistern was full. The land was safe. Her father was alive. Her children were loud and curious, and entirely themselves. And Luke Fletcher was coming around the corner of the barn, and he would see the kitchen window and look up, because he always looked up when he came around that corner, and she would be there, and he would know it. She was there. She waited. He came around the corner and he looked up and he saw her, and he smiled the smile that changed his face, the one she had been engineering situations to produce for 6 years, the one she had cataloged in her careful mental files under the heading of essential and irreplaceable. She smiled back from the window in the afternoon light, in the life she had built and chosen and defended and made exactly what she wanted it to be. Everything was right where it was supposed to be. Everything was found.